The diplomatic certainties that define the post-Cold War era are crumbling, not with a bang, but with the click of a social media post and the rustle of a grain contract. In the opening weeks of 2026, a seismic shift in global power dynamics has been quietly unfolding across the vast wheat fields of Saskatchewan and the bustling ports of Shanghai, catching Washington off guard and redrawing the lines of economic allegiance. At the heart of this realignment is a high-stakes gamble by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who has boldly steered his nation into the orbit of Beijing, triggering an explosive reaction from a volatile White House that now sees its closest neighbor and its greatest strategic rival in an unprecedented codependent embrace. The fuse was lit not in Ottawa or Beijing, but in the rarefied alpine air of Davos, Switzerland. It was there, at the World Economic Forum in mid-January, that Prime Minister Carney delivered what many interpreted as a eulogy for the old world order and a declaration of independence for the so-called middle powers. Standing before a gathering of global elites, Carney suggested that the rules-based international order, as the West had known it, was effectively over. A pointed rebuke delivered just as President Donald Trump was threatening European allies over Greenland. For a Canadian leader to openly question the very framework that had underpinned Western hegemony for decades was seen in Washington not as a philosophical observation, but as an act of insubordination. Within hours, the tone from the White House shifted from dismissive to openly hostile. Just days before Carney's Davos speech, President Trump had offered a tepid blessing to the nascent Canada-China thaw, stating it was fine and that it was what the Canadian Prime Minister should be doing. But Carney's public challenge to American dominance, combined with his subsequent visit to Beijing, the first by a Canadian premier in nearly a decade, shattered that facade of tolerance. Trump took to his Truth Social platform with characteristic fury, warning that if Canada proceeded with its trade deals with China, it would immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming to the USA. The message was clear: diversification would be treated as an act of war. The specific catalyst for Washington's alarm is an agreement that, on paper, appears to be a pragmatic, sector-specific arrangement. During Carney's landmark visit to Beijing from January 14th to 17th, Ottawa and Beijing agreed to untangle a web of punitive tariffs that had crippled bilateral trade. Under the deal, China agreed to slash tariffs on Canadian canola seed, a product for which China is the world's largest market, from crippling rates of around 85% down to a combined rate of approximately 15%. In return, Canada will open its market to up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles annually, granting them entry at a modest 6.1% tariff, a stark contrast to the current 100% levy. For Canadian farmers, this was a lifeline. The numbers tell a story of profound economic interdependence that Canada could no longer afford to ignore. In 2024, a staggering 67% of Canada's exported canola seed, a crop worth around $4 billion, was destined for China. The agriculture and agri-food system employs over 2.3 million people in Canada, contributing roughly 7% of its GDP. When Ottawa followed Washington's lead in imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, Beijing retaliated with tariffs on Canadian agricultural products, creating what Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew described as a two-front trade war that disproportionately affects Western Canada. The Carney government's decision was framed not as a choice, but as a necessity to protect its own economic heartland. This new partnership has already begun to yield tangible results that extend far beyond canola. Trade analysts have confirmed that following Carney's visit, Canadian exports of agricultural products to China have started to pick up, unlocking an estimated $3 billion in export orders. But the optics of the deal have infuriated the Trump administration, which views it as a direct violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent accused Canada of performing a 180-degree turn on its previous commitment to a united front against Chinese trade practices, specifically pointing to the EV quota as a dangerous loophole that would allow cheap Chinese cars to infiltrate the North American supply chain. In a move that exposes the raw nerves in Washington, Beijing has simultaneously signaled that its rapprochement with Ottawa does not mean abandoning leverage with the United States. Mere days after Carney's visit, traders confirmed that China had booked its first cargoes of U.S. wheat since October 2024, following a separate meeting between the American and Chinese leaders. This dual-track approach allows China to reward Canada for its strategic shift, while keeping American farmers engaged, effectively playing its two largest Western trading partners against one another. It is a masterclass in realpolitik, leaving the White House to rage against a rival that is simultaneously a partner and a competitor. President Trump's reaction has been anything but measured. His threat of 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods, a move that would obliterate the $28 billion agricultural trade relationship between the two nations, was accompanied by a bizarre and sinister prediction that if Canada continued to do business with Beijing, China will eat them up within a year. The rhetoric has since escalated to include threats to block the completion of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a critical infrastructure project linking Windsor and Detroit, and even to cancel the Stanley Cup playoffs, a threat that baffled Canadian officials and citizens alike. Analysts believe Trump's fury is rooted in more than just trade deficits. It is a reaction to a perceived breach of vassalage. For the Trump administration, USMCA is not just a trade deal. It is a tool of geopolitical alignment, explains Shanghai-based international relations scholar Fu Borui. Seeing Canada pursue a strategic partnership with China, especially after Carney's Davos speech, is viewed as a betrayal. They see it as Canada attempting to become a leader of the middle powers to counterbalance U.S. influence. This perception is driving Washington to use the upcoming July 2026 USMCA joint review as a weapon, threatening to renegotiate the entire framework to Canada's detriment. Inside Canada, the political landscape is fracturing along predictable lines. While the prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, have largely welcomed the reopening of the Chinese market, opposition critics and some trade experts warn of the long-term consequences. They argue that by granting China concessions on EVs, Canada is undermining its own nascent manufacturing sector and exposing itself to potential espionage or coercive economic practices down the line. The government, however, is pushing back, with Carney's parliamentary secretary insisting the deal merely mirrors similar pragmatic arrangements the U.S. itself has made with Beijing, and that it fully respects USMCA obligations. The global impact of this schism is already being felt in commodity markets. As Canada and China deepen their agricultural ties, traditional trade flows are being disrupted. The prospect of a 100% U.S. tariff wall has sent shockwaves through the supply chain, forcing Canadian exporters to accelerate their pivot towards Asia. The LSE's Alexander Audencourt notes that with 70% of Canada's grain and oilseed typically exported to the U.S. and China, the current strategy is a calculated hedge against the volatility of the Trump administration, ensuring that Canada is not left with all its eggs in a basket that Washington is threatening to set on fire. For China, the payoff is immediate and strategic. Not only does it secure a reliable supply of canola and other agricultural goods, but it also cracks open a door for its politically sensitive EV industry into the North American market, a door the U.S. has tried desperately to seal shut. By leveraging Canadian pragmatism, Beijing has achieved a diplomatic breakthrough that weakens the unified Western front on technology and trade. As one analyst put it, this is a win-win for China, providing both economic security and a wedge to drive between its two primary competitors. Looking ahead, the coming months will be critical. The USMCA joint review scheduled for July looms as a potential point of no return. If Trump follows through on his threats to impose crippling tariffs, it would effectively tear up the agreement, potentially costing hundreds of thousands of jobs on both sides of the border. Meanwhile, Canada is doubling down on its diversification strategy. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly has confirmed that efforts to reduce dependence on the U.S. will continue, with the energy minister heading to India to negotiate deals on critical minerals and liquefied natural gas. There are also significant internal risks for Carney. While a poll from Global News found that 54% of Canadians favor more trade with China, the specifics of the EV deal remain controversial. Questions about data security and the potential for software vulnerabilities in Chinese vehicles are being raised in parliamentary committees. The government's response has been to suggest that such risks can be managed through graded restrictions, a stance that critics call dangerously naive given the sophisticated nature of state-linked cyber activities. As the geopolitical temperature rises, the rhetoric from both sides shows no signs of cooling. Prime Minister Carney, when asked about the potential impact of U.S. tariffs on Canadian living standards, retorted defiantly in French, "The impact of U.S. tariffs will be felt on the living standards of Americans, not Canadians." This confidence, however, will be tested if American consumers suddenly find Canadian lumber, agricultural products, and auto parts prohibitively expensive. The interdependence that has defined North American prosperity for half a century is being weaponized, with devastating potential. For American farmers, the situation presents a cruel irony. Just as China begins to re-enter the U.S. market for wheat, signaling a potential thaw, their Canadian competitors are being handed preferential access to the same massive market. The uncertainty is paralyzing, with agricultural futures oscillating wildly on every tweet and every rumored shipment. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has attempted to calm nerves by touting a historical, pragmatic mix of tariffs and optimizing trade arrangements. But on the ground in Kansas and Nebraska, the reality is one of confusion and fear that they are being sacrificed for a geopolitical grudge match. In the boardrooms of Beijing, the calculus is far simpler. Whether it is Canadian canola or American wheat, China needs to feed its population and its livestock. By deftly managing relationships with both Ottawa and Washington, Beijing ensures its food security while advancing its industrial goals. The message sent by these simultaneous deals is that China is open for business with anyone willing to deal, and that it will not be beholden to any single nation's foreign policy dictates. It is a position of strength that leaves its Western counterparts scrambling. The final act of this drama is yet to be written. If the U.S. follows through on its 100% tariff threat, it would trigger an economic shockwave unlike anything seen since the Great Depression, effectively ending the USMCA and forcing Canada into a permanent, accelerated embrace of Asian markets. If Washington blinks, it will do so from a position of diminished authority, having proven that its toughest ally is willing to defy it openly and survive. What is clear is that the era of automatic alignment between North American neighbors is over. In the windswept ports of Vancouver, where grain from the prairies is loaded onto massive vessels bound for Shanghai, there is a sense of a new era dawning. The cargo holds that once shipped almost exclusively south are now increasingly heading west. This is not just a trade route. It is a lifeline to a future where Canada can no longer rely on the kindness of its neighbor. The deal with China, born of necessity and forged in defiance, represents a pivot of historic proportions. As one senior Canadian trade official, speaking on condition of anonymity, confided to Reuters, "We are watching the dissolution of the post-war architecture in real time. The assumption was always that the United States would be the stable center of our economic universe. That assumption is gone. We are now building a new navigation system, and for better or worse, it has a compass that points to Beijing. The world watches as the wheat fields of the New West become the battleground for the new Cold War."